So thank you so much for being here for the second day, and we're going to start with Dr. Jean Bartunek for today's colloquium. Dr. Jean Bartunek is a Robert A. and Evelyn J. Ferris Chair and Professor of Management and Organization in Boston College. She is so well known in our field. Everybody knows her, pretty much.
If you don't, just...
You should feel guilty. She received her PhD and master's degrees in social and organizational psychology from the University of Illinois at Chicago. Most recently, she received a Doctor of Laws from the University of Roehampton in England. Before being a professor at Boston College, she taught at grade school, high school, and was a visiting lecturer and a visiting assistant professor at the University of Illinois. She then joined Boston College in 1977. Dr. Bartunek has received numerous grants, over 20 honors, and has written dozens upon dozens of publications. Her research largely focuses on organizational change and transformation, social cognition, emotions, and the conflict. She's also interested in insider-outsider research collaborations. So please join me and welcome Dr. Bartunek.
Well, I'm very grateful to be here. There are many of you, a few of you that I've been lucky enough to know for a while, and many of you whose names I have known. So meeting you in person is wonderful. And I also just want to make one comment. I think Erica and Inga are wonderful. I was not their sole mentor. I was on committees. I didn't chair either of their dissertations, but I had the chance to teach them and work with them. And this is the first time I think I've had a chance to be at a conference with the two of you in particular, with two of our graduates. So it's a great honor. Tony, could you let me know when we're running out of time, because I don't have the foggiest notion how long this will take. I obsessed about it last night. So there are lots of examples of conflict between scholars. One very famous one, obviously, is Freud versus Jung, and I just got to see how to do this. And another one more recently in social science is Glaser versus Strauss, in which people have sort of had to pick all kinds of people have had to pick sides. But there are also smaller, more mundane conflicts between scholars working on scholarly papers. Maybe none of you have experienced any of these when you've been working with somebody else. But a lot of people have, and I was particularly conscious of that when I was chair of the Ethics Adjudication Committee for the Academy of Management, because a lot of the things that would come to us has to do with this person's taking credit for all of my work, this person stole my data, things like that. So it's not something, to my knowledge, that's talked about a lot, but it is something that I'm quite sure is experienced a lot. And sometimes it gets really bad. So what I'm going to do in this presentation is talk about conflicts that Sarah Sarah's from the University of Iowa, and I experienced while we were writing an editorial essay on academics and practitioners are alike and unlike. The paradoxes that's important to mention of academic-practitioner relationships. This is a paper that was published this July in the Journal of Management. And the major question we're addressing in the paper, though it'll be a subtext going through the presentation, is what were the kinds of conflicts we were experiencing, and what roles did they play in our work? And we did something quite unusual in the paper. Our conflicts were so frequent and so bad that we ended up with a 2-paragraph concluding reflection in it. Something we've never done before, and I haven't seen much, but we figured this is an essay, we get to do this. So I just want to read some, this is an excerpt from it, but I think it's important. We are very good friends. We've collaborated on research projects multiple times over the past 15 years. We expected that collaborating on this essay would go as smoothly as our other projects have, but we discovered we have very different ideas of what the essay should be about. So it has gone through wildly varying drafts with frequent disagreements that produced several impasses that delayed the final project and at one point threatened to unravel our friendship. And in the end, it was mostly our desire to preserve our friendship that kept us working. It may be that things like that happen to you all when you're having some fights about what's going on. Erica, maybe, I would imagine there were some issues of friendship that play a role for you and Tamara that were important. So we published this and we got conflicting responses from readers of our paper. And one of the things Sarah and I did in writing the paper, we always talked about author 1 and author 2. That's because Sarah wasn't going to be here. She was a little queasy because this first response, there's an optimal amount of transparency in writing articles and maximum is not it. They go, oh boy, if you thought this was maximum, you have no idea. But this was from a former student of Sarah's who felt really badly. So when I give this talk, I'm going to talk about Sarah and me. But anything I have written down, at least for now, is author 1 and author 2 that I think will be easier because Sarah isn't here to defend herself. So the second one isn't exactly a quote, but I was talking with Chris Keys, who had been my advisor in graduate school, who's a community psychologist, and a friend named Meg Bond, who, who's also a community psychologist, and I mentioned that we had wrote this essay, and they said, you talked about yourselves in an article? Apparently psychologists, social psychologists don't do that. So if any of you have done it, you're clearly wrong. But a couple of people in management, one guy in particular, Joe Mahoney from the University of Illinois who teaches strategy, said, this is refreshing to see this. So actually that was kind of encouraging because it meant that at least somebody had actually read it. So there are models for exploring one's own experiences. Teresa Mabile and her co-authors had written a paper about what their experience was of working together as academics and practitioners on an article that later became a book. Bill Torbert, who was a faculty member in my department, who has since retired, has talked about the importance of doing first-person research as well as all the folks out there. And a model that we adapted for trying to, as a kind of general framework for talking about the kind of conflicts that we had, was a model of conflict developed by Eddie Jen, who in articles 1975 and 1997 that then got extended quite a bit more, talked about 3 different types of conflicts that work groups, which might be dyads, might experience. And these are relationship conflicts where you're really not getting along with each other. Task conflicts where you disagree about what you're doing. And process conflicts where there's conflict about how task accomplishment should proceed. And I will say, just my experience with ethics adjudication chair, actually a lot of the issues are process conflicts. I spent much more time on this than this person. I spent all the time writing this paper, and my advisor insists on being a co-author. Things like that. That is a kind of process conflict. But, okay, so these were just, we use these as a basis for talking about our experiences. There is a lot of research. I won't go through all this right now. I'll just post it. But I would just mention that most of it that comes out of that paradigm, not all, but most of it is in experimental frameworks, where somebody manipulates how much task conflict you have and then sees what happens over time, which might be a very short period of time. Or somebody manipulates relationship conflict and see how it's related to task conflict. There is also some research, although most of it tends to be in from a different set of people, about how to restore conflict, how to restore relationships with each other when there is conflict. And forgiveness isn't exactly listed in there, but apologies and penance sort of are related. So we can learn more later on this afternoon about how forgiveness might play a role. And my experience is that these do tend to be explored in different settings. People who set up an experimental manipulation to measure task conflict don't often look at how what reparative mechanisms are taking place at the same time. We were lucky with our data collection, and that we're both pack rats, electronic or otherwise. We're lucky about the fact that Sarah lives in Iowa, I live in Massachusetts, so virtually all of our interactions occurred remotely, most of them over email, which we saved. When we had phone or Skype conversations, which we did from time to time, we took notes. And then what we did was use this as a basis for our analysis here. And in particular, Sarah constructed, as we were working on this paper, a Table 3 backstory was the name of what she constructed. It's the table that's in your paper that is labeled Table 1 in the paper, but I was trying to get the actual terms here. That included what the title, because one of the things that meant the title of the paper changed regularly, sometimes weekly. So we're talking about what the main premise was of the paper at one point, what were some of the things we were experiencing, and then what types of conflict were these representing. And what I want to do in the talk is primarily focus on vignettes, 8 different vignettes, where I will use the first column and the third column sort of as background, but I want to focus on how we were getting along with each other at those times. So, the background, we have known each other since 1998, when this woman who I had never met called and left a message on my voicemail. That was the most amazing, inviting message I've ever gotten in my life. I want to co-edit the special issue of the Academy Management Journal on academic practitioner stuff, and he would be a perfect person to work with because I have to pick somebody from the AMJ board, and you're the best person from the AMJ board. But it was just a totally inviting message. Anybody who knows Sarah knows she's like that all the time. So I said, whoever you are, sure, as long as I don't have to work hard. But then we've ended up collaborating on a number of projects. This is some of them. And my usual experience with Sarah is Sarah tells me to do something and then I say yes. And it works out. So we are good friends. We've had it always works when Sarah tells me to do something, I say yes, so this is going to work great too. And we have these 8 vignettes that I want to start with the 2 that are linked with a particular date, but they're a period of time around that date. So sometime, I think in the winter of 2012, Sarah sends me an email saying, the Journal of Management has just sent out a call for papers for its review issue, and I think we should do one on academic practitioner relationships, and you should be the first author. So, yes, ma'am, sure, I'll be glad to do that. So we work on that, and the submission the proposal is due by mid-June, and what I do is end up collecting a ton of literature that I could find, and one of the things we discover is that virtually all of not all of it, but a great deal of the literature is opinion pieces. And there isn't much actual research at all. And so what we're saying is what we need to do is figure out a way to categorize it so that it can actually be sort of theoretical. And Deborah Rupp, who's the editor at the time of JOM, writes back and says, you can't have a theoretical review paper of papers that don't have any theory. Yeah. So what she said was, we were wondering if you might have interest in developing this paper to be featured as a guest editorial for the review issue. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I mean, this is fabulous. We don't even have to work as hard. We don't have to be as systematic. How hard can work writing an SAP, right? We don't have to spend a year and a half building a database for anything. We don't even have to think that hard. You bet, we're all in. So, this next phase goes from when we finally get we're invited to write the review essay and we're trying to write the first draft of the paper. It's still going to be a reviewed paper that we're not guaranteed acceptance. But we work on the paper. I do most of the work on it, as Sarah had told me from the beginning that I would do. And still figuring this is easy, I say, okay, so there's all this crappy academic practitioner stuff out there. Here are 4 ways systematically that you can think about it. You can think about it in terms of intergroup relationship, you can think about knowledge transfer, you can think about social identity, and you can think about, you can think about this stuff about paradox and dialectics too. So I think this is a cinch, right? All we need to do is say, yes, there are some theoretical frameworks you can use. But then the reviewers disagree. These are really brief excerpts, but one of the reviewers said, what kind of construct is the gap? What kind of question is that? And then from one friendly reviewer, I got the overall sense you were both a couple of pros at the top of your game, writing with insight and authority, except where you sounded like doctoral students writing a term. and this friendly reviewer pointed out many places in our paper. In fact, to this reviewer, we sounded a lot more like doctoral students writing a term paper than we did to like pros at the top of our game. So, oh dear, I guess we're gonna have to change something. That we don't have to have the thing until a few days after the Academy Management meeting in August of 2013. And I'm thinking, well, this is simple. They think we're just tossing too much stuff out. I think we should just focus on intergroup relationships because that's obviously the theoretical basis. I was trained in social and organizational psychology. Sarah wasn't, so if she doesn't know that, well, that's her problem. And so Sarah contacts me in, I think, late May and said, we haven't actually done anything about this. And I said, well, yeah, because it's going to be a cinch. And Sarah said, I don't think so. I think they're asking for something really big. So I said, well, okay, maybe it's really big, but it's going to be all about intergroup relationships. And Sarah is intrigued by the fact that most of the writing is so awful, so she thinks maybe we could see if there's anything we can make out of the empirical papers that we're able to find. So this is all work that's going on between February and August. So we get to August, and I have written a draft that says we have to focus on intergroup relationships, and incidentally, there are categories of intergroup relationships that are sort of like the stuff we talked about before. And Sarah, not surprisingly, said, this is sort of like what we did before. And she also had, by this time, gone through a lot of the empirical literature and said, how is this stuff empirical? They say it's empirical. That means they looked at something. And they say it's empirical. That doesn't mean they are. So she was really intrigued by that. And then she keeps thinking. Sarah is much more extroverted than I am, and she also keeps thinking, which is wonderful in many ways and complicated. It was complicated for me in this paper. And so she writes and says, I think maybe we can get 2 papers out of this. We can have the JOM editorial plus something else, I think. Then she adds, you know what, paradox would be a lot better than the stupid intergroup relationship stuff as a framework. So I write back and do more work on the paper and say, okay, I switch it all to paradox. Like you tell me to do something, I say yes, okay. I've gone our intergroup relationships. Let's replace them with much more about paradox and some ways that academic practitioner relationships are paradoxical. And she writes back and says, I like the idea of doing something about paradox, but this is something that might work very well for an AMR piece. I think this is way too ambitious for a 26-page editorial. It's way too complicated. And she says, let's get rid of all this stuff and go back to the earlier idea of this is all talk and no research. And I got really mad. And I responded, this was an email that I can look at there. They want us to develop something conceptual. I have spent whole weeks doing nothing but this paper, including developing some conceptual foundation. I don't see what you're recommending as developing something conceptual. I think you get the point, right? It was a very angry email, and this is only an excerpt. So we're still working. And there's something else that happened on the side for each of us early in July. Sarah was supposed to be going on a hiking vacation in France with her husband. I mean, she did go, but she had broken her foot before that. And she had her foot in a cast, and it was very uncomfortable. It was messing up her back. And the idea of going hiking in France when you've got your broken foot was very complicated for her. And I had given a talk, an invited talk at a conference that I had thought had gone miserably. So I was feeling, I'm a complete failure. I'll never say anything decent again. So anything she said to me, I took it super personally, like this is just another sign that I'm useless. She was feeling terrible, having to go to the doctor all the time. So there was all this stuff going on. And writing me from France and saying, well, Paul's out hiking, I'm stuck in the hotel room, and we've got lousy internet. But, so this is all going on at the same time. She did respond to me. I can understand that you're upset, but we go back quite a long ways, and you're one of my closest friends. So relationship preservation is way more important to me than any single paper. And I write back, because I've been feeling really awful. And I said, part of the reason I was so upset and angry was I couldn't for the life of me figure out a way around the conundrum of our radically disagreeing about what we were doing and still be friends. So we actually have dinner together at the Academy of Management. We try to talk things out. We're having a little discomfort, but we're trying to talk. And I write to Deborah Rupp and say, oh, I'm so sorry, but we're not going to make tomorrow's deadline for the article. We're running a little late. You know, we had these various physical problems happen this summer, like a broken foot and so forth, and we couldn't get together. So it's going to take us a little longer. And Deborah writes back and says, no worries. I actually saw you talking at the meeting and was hoping to break away and say hello, but I couldn't. I said, oh my God, thank God. Thank God you didn't. I've never actually met her in person, to my knowledge, but I've had quite an email relationship with Deborah over time. So the paper keeps changing some, and what Sarah decides is, but I'm going to mention, this isn't part of this paper, but the whole front end, Sarah had thought was really awful, and I was being very rigid about it until she finally convinced me we had to get rid of that, which we did, which is great. But that wasn't as much part of this, but it's really important. So she says, okay, the only way we can figure this out is I'm going to give you feedback in the margins. I'm not going to challenge the whole topic. But I really think we need to send the paper out to some other friendly reviewers, an academic and a practitioner at least, because I just don't know enough about this area to do more. And so I say fine, and then Sarah Wright, we have a conversation on Skype, and she sends me her notes the next day and says, I also suggested that this is the way it was in her notes. If this goes well and we feel great about the paper when we send it in, we might conclude by telling our own backstory about the tensions and what we learned from it. So that sounds good. It makes it into the draft that we send to the other people. And Sarah sent it to one former student, not the one who later ended up dumping on us. And I think somebody she really trusted to be really smart. And he loved the paradox idea. And he also suggested, here's what you have about paradox and here are some other things. And I think that was a huge moment for Sarah because she could feel like somebody who knows what they're talking about says this is okay. And it was her former student also who suggested the title that we ended up using. And then I sent it to my former student, John Austin, who was an academic who taught at the University of Washington at Bothell and then at Penn State for a few years, and then decided that he'd had it with academics who didn't care about regular people. And now he works for a consulting firm and does a lot of executive training. And he wrote a ton of comments that were very helpful, so much so that we often inserted him as a practitioner voice in the paper itself, which is a little unusual to do. But he said many things that were helpful, including the fact that practitioners often don't sit around talking about the fact, I'm a practitioner. They say, I'm a manager, or I do this. He also commented that one of the reasons academics get into trouble is that we focus so much on ourselves as scholars and our identities that we forget that we're teachers and that we're working with practitioners all the time, at least in business schools. So both of them were incredibly helpful. It was really important. And both of them said, you know, it's a really good idea for you to talk about your own tensions. So we did it. So this is now October, the day before the drop dead deadline. We actually got the paper in, which is a sign of how well we were doing. And both of us actually felt really good about the paper. If we hadn't had Sarah's notes, I don't think we would remember that carefully what the conflicts were. But Sarah did have in mind another paper that we could write still about the empirical papers, and later she tried to do something with it, and they were even worse the next time she looked at it. So let me just make some preliminary comments. This is probably a lot less stressful than with somebody who was working with a co-author maybe 5 or 6 years with absolutely no guarantee that anything possible is going to come out of this. I mean, we knew it had to be accepted, but we knew the bias was for us. That makes a difference. But another thing that affected us, we were so used to succeeding that it never dawned on us that we wouldn't. So it made our conflict stand out much more starkly. And by the way, we have taken back our initial enthusiasm for writing scholarly essays. Give me data, or literature or something. Forget it, we're not gonna talk about anything provocative. Or I guess it could be an essay as long as it's not provocative at all. But what they wanted us to do. So we certainly experienced intertwined task, relationship, and process conflicts. I realized as I've been rehashing all this paper from when we sent it in, those are a minimal structure for talking about what we were doing. We were experiencing these kinds of conflicts, and they don't convey a lot of what the experience actually was, but they're at least a helpful handle for some kind of structure that enables us to go forward. So I would say our disagreements started with task conflicts, they moved to process conflicts, and ended up being relational. And other issues that were going on in our daily lives affected them. So a broken foot, feeling like you're a complete catastrophe and disaster as an academic who's never going to say anything good again, that affects your dealing with other people. So did the fact that each of us had other work we had to do, so we weren't just thinking about this. Another thing we did was we did try to redress conflicts whenever they came up. Both of us have had experience with conflicts that didn't get worked out well. And we were very conscious of trying. It mattered to us to get this worked out well. What helped was our desire to remain friends. our distance, our prior history, our acknowledgement of our conflicts. And we did follow much of the advice from the Red and Gray article. We did explain why we were trying something. We did give apologies. We did all the time say, I recognize how upset you are, I'm concerned about you. We did not do any penance. Except maybe working on the paper was penance enough. One of the things we became very conscious of is a lot of the literature on these types of conflicts, it interferes with getting a task done well. But we think actually that the conflict was really crucial for us. It made us do much better. The essay did get accepted. When it finally, we set it in, we got a conditional accept after the October submission, and all we had to do in January, I think because the journal was running late, but they said there are some typos we want you to fix. We could do that. We got the London School of Economics has a social sciences impact blog. They invited us to post this on it. This moved far beyond, let's slap on some stuff about intergroup relationships, knowledge transfer, and social identity, and say, yes, academics, you can do this. And we're still friends and still working together. There was a chapter that I had been invited to write for a book that was due in June, a short chapter, because it was based on earlier work that Sarah and I had done together. I wrote her and said, I have no idea how this is going to get done. She said, do you want me to take over? And I said, yes, please. She did it. And it worked out great. So I think that if we take standard conflict literature based on some experiments, we would say, if you just looked at our emails, you'd often think this isn't going to be a complete catastrophe. This stuff is not going to work. But paradoxically, number one, it mirrored some of the conflicts that exist about academic practitioner relationships. It was kind of a parallel process to that. And it did lead us to understanding what was going on in much more depth and, in Michelle's terms, maybe with much more empathy in our taking others' perspectives than just cognitively. I could see one logic you're working out of, I could see a logic you're working out of. It made us feel what was happening much more. And now we're friends. Now, if we were next door neighbors, I'm not sure that would be the case, but we are still friends. So that's the presentation. Yeah.
So first, I want to thank you for being so frank and forthcoming about the talk that you had at the conference that eroded your confidence. I recently had something similar happen to me, and I'm thinking, I look at these academics like you and people who are so established, and I'm never going to get there, this kind of thing. And so your frankness about that actually was really refreshing.
Oh, it was horrible. For a whole month, I was beyond depressed.
But and I'm not saying that it's good to hear because that happened, but it's good to hear that it happens to people like you, being more of a junior faculty myself. It's refreshing to hear because, so thank you for being so frank about that. And also I wonder, to the degree that that's a systematic variable in some of these things, an unexplored systematic variable when somebody's self-confidence is compromised,
Yeah.
and then there's constructive criticism, it reframes the entire discussion. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about that and how because it sounded like Sarah was having a frustration issue, but it wasn't an issue related to work, that self-efficacy in work, where your issue was more an erosion of confidence. So do you think that, I guess just maybe a little bit more on how erosion of self-confidence can create further conflict?
Well, sure. I mean, one thing it's worth saying is that when I reviewed a lot of the experimental literature in the process of setting up this paper, none of them talk about something like that. And it would be I guess you could manipulate it by saying, Susan, you have had this crummy experience and you feel like a failure, but it's not quite the same as actually having it. What I think I became conscious of is that there were that experience affected me on a lot of things, not just the paper with Sarah, but that was probably the most salient because it was the thing I cared about the most, and I think that makes a difference. So the way it affected me was it was as you were saying, I was feeling very vulnerable. If anybody said anything awful on any topic, I would, yes, say I'm useless. I think even though the fact that it was psychological and not physical, Sarah's broken foot was really complicated for her because she tried some things and they hadn't worked. She was spending a ton of time in pain. It screwed up her back. She didn't really want to go to France and sit in a hotel room all day while her husband hiked. So she was very frustrated by that too. So I think that was also an emotional experience as well as a physical one. And I'm thinking of maybe a slightly broader framing of what you're saying is there something affectively strong going on that has a negative component that comes as well as taking a lot of time? Like we were slow at first because I got pneumonia. You know, it didn't have anything to do with my self-concept, but it took a long time where I couldn't do any work. But I don't think those things are taken into account at all. The rest of people's lives are not taken into account at all when we're focusing on just this one set of interactions, which experimental design leads us to do. Yes, sir.
Can you say a little more about your last comments, good thing we weren't neighbors and the
Well, I don't know if
1,000 miles away. I think I know what you're driving at here, but can you just say a little more about the implications of that?
Sure. I mean, I'm just inferring this, but if we were just used to popping into the other person's house and say, can I borrow the sugar or something like that, then it would have been much more stark if all of a sudden we weren't going back and forth. But we have always had, in the last 15 years, times when we're working on something together and times when we aren't. So, and I knew that she was, heavily involved in executive education at one point. So that was a way of saying, no, I don't expect to hear from you for a while. But if I could see if her car left the drive, then I would know much more about when she's not working on this. So I think that's just what I mean, is the expectations of connection were much more minimal. Yeah.
So you were successful? The
Well, I
task was
think so.
successfully complete, but could you say a little more about actually how you two collaborate? Because people collaborate in so many different ways. It sounds like you did a lot of writing, and some of your co-author commented on your writing, but did she do a lot of active writing?
No,
herself
she
along
had
the
told
way?
me from the beginning that I would be doing more. When it got worse though was when it got worse when thinking she was the one who really wanted to focus on paradox. I took it in that direction, and she didn't know anything about paradox. And then she couldn't say more. So she was doing a very good job. At one point, pardon me?
She wrote a lot.
Yeah. At one point there was a whole section on how there are academic practitioners disjunctures in every single field in management. There was a long history at the beginning of how this has come about that got encapsulated into one set of references. I mean, there were all kinds of things at the beginning because I tend to, if I'm going to do something, I can't do it without sitting down and doing a comprehensive literature review, whether I look at it or not. I have to start that way, which she reasonably pointed out is a way to end up getting stuck and not doing something really novel. because I got so caught up and we've got to respond exactly to everything that's been said. And she said, you're taking away all the stuff, this is supposed to be an essay. This is supposed to be a provocative essay. It's not supposed to be a literature review of everything that everybody has said in every field on this topic. So she was very good at catching things that needed to go and getting rid of them and telling me nicely enough that I did it even though I was bitching the whole time. But so I mean, it was agreed more from the beginning that I would do more, and that balanced another chapter we had published in 2013 where she did the great bulk of the stuff. So it has felt like it overall, it's a fair connection. Yeah, Erica, yeah.
So when I read your paper, and then again hearing this, the framework about task, interpersonal, and process, I guess,
Yeah.
Makes me think that, so Tamara and I were having task conflict. We were trying to figure out what was going on with this team. It was actually only when she made it interpersonal by confronting me about something around me that it actually became much more generative. So
Became generative.
yeah. So I'm aware of this literature. I know that interpersonal conflict is generally problematic. I do think that under certain circumstances, it can be perhaps even more generative than task conflict in many situations. So
Yeah, I agree. If there are things like, there's a reason you feel motivated to try to work well with it.
Mm-hmm. Right, exactly. Are you really invested in a relationship?
Yeah. Yes.
I have two thoughts. One is, in a sense, the literature and learning communities in this kind of relates. And so in what case is a dyad becomes generative, and how that then relationship becomes kind of a learning community, although a community of two.
Yeah.
Because I think it does speak to that in ways that I think are novel. Your paper speaks to that in ways that are novel. And I don't know about this, but there does seem to be gendered issues. Particularly, you've mentioned your co-author's husband going hiking, and the way the women's lives, traditional and untraditional relationships, whatever, tends to be very strongly relational.
Yeah.
As Michelle was, describing in her work yesterday. And so I wondered if there was something particularly, gendered about the dynamics.
Oh,
of
I'm
it.
certain.
So I think that the health research, much of it doesn't apply to women. In this case, I don't know how much of this would apply to men.
Raw data, please.
I think one of the underlying things that is not discussed, like in the trust literature and the organizational literature at all, is the effort that people put into maintaining trust and maintaining relationships. And that's a lot of
Over time.
And what you're saying is that it's not just that you behave the way the other person expects, and that's why your relationship is maintained. It's that despite the fact that you have conflict, you're putting in a lot of work to make sure that that conflict doesn't destroy the connection.
Yeah.
And I think men do that too, but though they may do it in a different way.
Yeah, that's true.
I think the emphasis with a lot of men in collaboration, some of it can be competitive, and at least more so. And I think that dynamic gets altered depending on how competitive the two co-authors are. I think the dynamic is probably much healthier if there's an established friendship relationship. But I think if you have two scholars, especially men that are socialized to be competitive with one another and kind of on top dog kind of striving, I think that it could become much more about the egos and less about the work. So I think the relational perspective that you have with your friend probably not only save the paper, but save the friendship. Where I think if it were two stranger competitive men, I think it wouldn't work out.
Yeah, I'm really struck by this idea that the conflict was really generative, it was really constructive to go through this conflict process. And yet we still keep talking about the even though you had conflict, just like the conflict, it sounds more like we should be introducing conflict, or what you were suggesting. Maybe it's gendered, I don't know, maybe it happens so easily when men or something like that. But, you know, I've had a lot of co-authors who've been women, and I wonder, you know, we tell our MBA students, you know, get a devil's advocate, you know, make sure that you're having productive conflict and stuff. And I'm wondering if we should try to build this into our collaborations. And it's distinct from providing a critical eye to each other, I think, because we have that sort of, you know, training about, you know, here's, you know, I think you're going to need this for the methods or this for the methods and stuff, but more is larger. I think we're approaching this completely wrong. Or, you know.
As you all raise these, it dawns on me that it's actually totally relevant that Sarah had been the editor of the Academy Management Journal. And so when she said something's going to get people off the mark, she knew. Because she knew what worked and what didn't work, and that was stuff I didn't catch at all. So I think even if it might seem like it's, you just say this is wrong, it ends up being really crucial to how to frame a paper that is going to accomplish your purpose. And she was used to telling people very straightly,
Yeah,
change this.
yeah.
And that actually, and that had actually, that I think actually added immensely to my trust that even though it really made me mad when she wanted to change things, she actually knew what she was talking about. So there is an element of friendship actually that probably gets added to the trust and the basic competency of the other person you're working with. That is, because I could be really good friends with people, I would, well, but maybe you've had this experience, I've had the experience of some people I was friends with, I collaborated on a paper, and that was enough that I had no aspiration to connect with them on any work-related project ever again. Because if we were going to be friends, we were going to have to totally stay out of work. So I think that's another dimension that gets added, is a kind of trust, a trust issue, but trust in the competence of somebody, not just that they care about your welfare, but they also do it in a way that conveys that they know what they're talking about.
But not only is the trust and the focus on the relationship, but maybe we should be trying to have more conflict.
Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't, you know, we all
Oh,
know
yeah.
conflict is problematic sides, but maybe it is really generative. Maybe we would produce better work if we were trying to be more thoughtful about introducing conflict into the working.
But do you think that we don't have conflict, or that we
Yeah.
spend so much time masking it and suppressing it so that we really, I think the conflict is there.
Yeah.
It's whether we recognize it and sit with it,
Yeah.
rather than trying to smooth it over, or just say you do that second, I'll do this second.
Yeah.
You think we don't have that? Because I think it's.
That's always my New Year's resolutions.
I
Get more conflict.
Yeah.
I think we often solve it that way.
Yeah, that's, yeah,
Even
I
at
think
this
it's still
level,
the conflict, yeah, those
can-
can, then I think it really is general, but I think it's there, I think you have that, those opportunities.
So I had a pretty similar experience, and both of us actually trust researcher. So actually, we try to build trust, but like we have different idea about how to write the paper. So we actually brought a third person that we both like, and then we give a third opinion, like, well, what do you think this paper is going to go? And then actually that worked out.
Well, Dan Caprar actually was the person that Sarah had sent the paper to, he's out teaching in Australia. Dan and John played absolutely crucial roles. You're saying that makes me aware that they were both people who took it very seriously, who didn't know the details of what was going on. And I think that's a really good
So
point.
it's just like a couple conflicts. Sometimes it gets really intense when it's between two people, but when you have a third person, it diffuses the conflict intensity. So like, and the third person can give an objective look about what's going on.
Yeah. Sure.
Yeah, just kind of two comments. One is that I think, again, when there's a conflict, like conflict with the reveal comments, I think, again, the conversation tends to be about how do we kind of compromise, find something that satisfies both, rather than really take the high road and the challenge. So I think that's at least personally a fundamental problem. Then another thing is that I have, recent years find that, getting your collaborators, your colleagues to kind of become the third party. And so, rather than have the conflict to escalate, even when there isn't that final draft yet that you can share, just having another colleague of yours to read or review your comments, and 15 minutes, they can kind of help to also kind of get you to the higher road, rather than kind of compromise and divide the challenge.
Yeah.
I just wanted to comment, just in your comment, Tony, and yours, Jean, about the incredible generosity in the field of, the way our colleagues, attend to and critique the work. And as a journal editor, I was just stunned with the way people are really willing to read other people's work and give a deep thought and be both critical and constructive and helpful. It's an amazing culture.
It is.
Yeah, I just wanted to
Yeah,
comment
no,
on
I
it.
think you're right, and we do it without pay. I think in finance they pay it.
Don't let the neoliberals hear you.
Yeah, okay, submitted, yeah.
But one thing that's emerging real quick, if I could, is a social exchange theory and social exchange perspective, and based on what Susan said and what Tony was saying, it seems a lot of this is based on if you feel there's an equitable exchange of ideas and relationships, where if you're constantly doing reviews where you're putting thoughtful, careful comments, constructive comments, and then you get a review that's jumbled, one paragraph, this is the worst piece of junk I've ever seen, don't ever submit to the journal again, then you start to become embittered. And so I think one of the things you're saying with creating conflict, I think only under certain circumstances, I think when there's an equitable social exchange going on. Like
Over time, so that you know it, especially so it doesn't all have to be in this paper. It can be, you can trust that it's more one-sided this one. But as long as you know it's going to balance out. And when Sarah had said, she figured out the opportunity. She said, let's do this, let's you do this, let's do it together. Without that, I wouldn't have even known about it. I wasn't on the mailing list. So, yeah, so she made it possible to happen. And there was a tough, so I was surprised working through this, how much more there was to what we were going on and how it just isn't possible in a short time, but at least we could convey some of the flavor of it. So, thank you.
Thank you.